Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Pleasure to see you all coming on for our first webinar of the season, which is about the Kent and Sussex freight strategy and matters relating to rail freight in the south of England. I think the south of England is often an overlooked area for rail freight. People tend to think of Kent and Sussex as the commuter belt, as being a rail freight free zone, and it absolutely isn't, and it's absolutely right and proper that we give it a bit of focus today. I'm really enjoying looking forward to hearing some more about it. We've got a great lineup today. Simon Hulse, who is a strategic planner, Kent and Sussex Network Rail, and has been holding the pen on the Kent and Sussex freight strategy. So Simon's going to be telling us about the planning work that they've been doing, what that will mean for the future of rail freight in the Kent and Sussex area. And then Simon Kendler, who's the regional freight manager for Kent and Sussex, is going to be talking to us about some of the work they're doing on the ground now, and also the plans to develop rail freight in line with Simon H's strategy. And finally, Rory Higgens, who's rail contracts manager at Tarmac, will be talking to us about the importance of this region for Tarmac, what they're doing, and their plans for development in the future as well. So it's a really great lineup. We are recording this webinar. It will be available later on our YouTube channel as normal. So if you do need to step away or miss it, or you want to share it with colleagues later, you'll be able to do so. And if you want to have a copy of the slides from today's presentation, just drop a note in the chat or email Phil or myself, and we'll get those over to you as well. Just whilst we've got the start, a couple of other things to say. Firstly, we will at the end of this have time for questions and discussion. If you've got a question, a thought, a comment, please do drop that in the Q&A box, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. If you can't, drop them in the chat, and we'll try and pick up as many of those at the end as time permits. We will have a hard stop on the hour. And if you've enjoyed this, then don't forget to book your place at our next Rail Freight Group meeting, which is on the 8th of November up in Sitwell in Sheffield. That's our AGM and our autumn group meeting. That's our next event coming up. But that's all from me. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Simon Hulse. Simon's strategic planner at Network Rail for the Kent and Sussex area in the southern region. And Simon's going to talk to us about the work they've been doing on the freight strategy. So Simon, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Maggie. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's session. So I'm Simon Hulse, so I'm a strategic planner within Kent and Sussex. Strategic planning is basically, we plan for the railway for the long term, even in the current world that we live in now. We have an obligation as part of Network Rail to plan for the railway, and we've done, within the Kent and Sussex team that I work in, we've done a specific Kent and Sussex freight strategy. So this is probably the first time that we've actually ever done a freight specific study within the region. So I'm going to go through today the output of a study that I've been leading on for the last few years, and go through the outputs and how we've reached them and what the future might look like in the future, even if at the moment everything obviously seems a bit muddy in the water. But anyway, I'm going to give you a quick overview of what we've been doing for the last few years, and hopefully it will create some debate at the end with the Q&A session. Okay, so the first, good start. So we've never done a freight specific study before within Kent and Sussex. For those of you who are familiar with the Kent route study, there was mention of that within that study. So we were asked 5 years ago when I joined the team, having had experience in freight before, working in capacity planning and doing consultancy work which involved freight train planning. I was asked to do big task, of course, to look at freight generally across the region and look at a 30-year strategy for freight across Kent and Sussex. I'll talk a bit about Wessex later on, but obviously this is focusing purely on Kent and Sussex for the time being. So we've done a strategy that's been basically split over 3 different parts. So to make it more bite-sized and more easy to read and to digest as an industry, we've been working closely with our freight end users, Fox, Network Rail, and other stakeholders within the industry to deliver a strategy that's written down on paper and in a document that can be used and taken off the shelf in the future when potentially there may be funding and investment available to invest in the southern region for freight. I'm sure most of you know the Kent and Sussex routes, but obviously there's a lot of freight that does run on this part of the network. And I'm going to talk about sort of key areas today within this webinar. So we split the study into 3 different sort of digestible sort of modules. The first module was around baselining. We need to get an understanding of what runs today, who runs it, where does it run, and what are the constraints on the network. The second module was relation to a workshop that I held in around 2019 with freight end users, freight stakeholders, TfL, in relation to getting an understanding of where the issues are or where our stakeholders see concerns around freight in the future in the southern region. I'll cover that again next few minutes. And then finally, the third part was looking at the long term around freight markets. So obviously we've got Rory on today from aggregates perspective, and obviously aggregates is obviously a key player in terms of the commodity that's carried across the southern region. So the key themes that came out of the overall study have been in relation to the Brighton Main Line, North Kent Line in terms of capacity, future decarbonisation around what the future is for rail freight and decarb as general based on government policy, new freight markets, so that might not necessarily be express freight, which is obviously still quite in its infancy at the moment, but it could be new freight terminals, new aggregate terminals, which I'm sure Simon Kendler will probably talk about a bit more later as well. And obviously getting an understanding of the network constraints, which we talked about briefly, or talked about in the first module of the document. So kind of the circle on the left-hand side is kind of summarizing what I've just said around how we've actually got to the point where we are now in terms of producing a study. So I'm just going to go through now how we got to that, how we actually started doing this study in the first place. So our colleagues in Freight and Network Strategy Team and System Operator produced the London Rail Freight Strategy in 2021 during lockdown. And that piece of strategic advice gave a set of recommendations, which one of the recommendations was for adjoining routes such as Kent and Sussex to do their own specific freight study, which obviously I've been leading on and what I'm talking about today. And that was basically working closely with our Freight and Network Strategy Team to deliver this strategy and understand the issues that our freight end users face on a daily basis and what the issues might be in the future. And how we deliver a strategy around freight, because it's important that we consider that given the amount of traffic that runs on the southern region. So we've had three separate sort of points that we've looked at. So when we looked at the baselining, it was important to get an understanding of where stuff goes and the constraints themselves, because obviously understanding what the constraints are will obviously apply for how we deliver and how we meet future freight forecasts. The workshop was important to get an understanding from the freight end users and try and get everyone in the room together, which was really important in understanding how we try and kind of shape the strategy going forward. And then the third module around future freight forecasts and what we think the delivery of the strategy should be and how we should deliver it. Obviously, this study started before COVID, carried on during COVID, and obviously we've now come out of COVID, but obviously the issues are still there. The constraints are still there, even if people are traveling in different ways at different times of the day. But obviously freight still plays an important picture and is an important part of the Southeast landscape in terms of delivering materials to national projects such as work that's still continuing with High Speed 2 at the moment, and obviously potentially long-term sort of proposals around other national infrastructure schemes that may come more apparent in the future when things are a bit clearer. So just to kind of I did mention Wessex as well before. So we have a separate team within strategic planning, Wessex strategic planning, and they've been looking at freights separately through some of their studies they've been doing, looking at the Solent to West Midlands corridor and other studies within sort of the Southwest Main Line. But obviously the thematic issues around network constraints obviously cover the whole of the southern region, but specifically when we spoke to stakeholders, the two main areas of concern were the Brighton Main Line and the North Kent corridor, which I'm going to talk about now. So just to give you a slight context around sort of the short to medium term issues and long term issues around the Brighton Main Line. Obviously, it's a very busy corridor between London and Brighton. The West London line obviously comes in from the west, joins up at Clapham Junction, and obviously Clapham Junction, obviously a significant nodal point within the network where lines diverge and converge, and obviously freight obviously comes into to access the Kent and Sussex routes, or Sussex specifically, has to access from the West London line coming off from Acton and other parts of sort of West London area. So obviously with the Brighton main line, there are sort of 6 terminals. Obviously 5 are currently operational, and you probably include Stuart's Lane, which is obviously nearer to London, on the outskirts of London Victoria. So what we did is we tried to get an understanding first of what the actual issues are here and now. Obviously, within our role, we don't necessarily cover that in much detail, but we do obviously try and give as much context as possible to kind of tell the story from start to finish. And obviously, from a strategic point of view, which is obviously what the work that I do over a long-term period, we need to get an understanding of what the sort of strategic themes are around new terminals, future forecasts, where we think freight will be in the future, and obviously the proposals were to build new infrastructure around the Croydon area as part of the Croydon area remodelling scheme, which is obviously still stuck in the RNAP pipeline that obviously none of us have yet to hear much else about, given where we are at the moment. But obviously, there's key themes on the right-hand side are important components in how to actually deliver this long-term strategy for freight, but also specifically the concerns raised by stakeholders in relation to the Brighton main line. So in terms of how we actually trying to get an understanding of the Brighton main line here and now, and obviously in the future, we got our advanced timetable team in Milton Keynes, who specifically do long-term timetable studies on behalf of strategic planning colleagues, including myself, to look at the Brighton main line in more detail. So we gave them a concept idea on the basis at the time that by 2026 there would be, or 2036, sorry, the delivery of the Brighton main line and Croydon area remodelling scheme would have been delivered. So the intention was that the capacity scheme and the timetable study would be aligned to each other, and that the new infrastructure at Croydon would be in place to allow to untangle all the tracks in the Croydon area, which I'm sure hopefully some of you are aware of through your work and wider industry reading. And the key point we did the timetable study was at the moment there's an hourly standard freight path in each direction on the Brighton main line. There are multiple freight terminals, as I've just mentioned, 5 at the moment that are operational, one that's due to come online at some point in the near future. But they're obviously, in terms of how we actually meet future demand, we did a timetable study based around the delivery of the CARS scheme and post CARS timetable, which would see a significant increase in passenger services on this corridor, but obviously making sure that we included our stakeholder aspirations to run a second hourly freight path on the Brighton main line between Clapham and Croydon all the way down to Newhaven, pretty much on the Sussex coast, but also the intermediate terminals in between. And the intention was of the timetable study that the timetable team would look at a second hourly freight path. So it'd be basically a freight train every half an hour, near enough within each hour in each direction, to meet the demand based on what our freight end users wanted and what our Fox wanted as well. So the key points from the capacity study was basically six key areas around tactical interventions. So one of those was around Crawley New Yard, and at Salford Yard, where currently at the moment those 2 terminals you can only access from the country end of those terminals rather from the London end. But if you had access from the London end, you would clear the slow lines, where it was 4-track there quicker, and obviously in terms of performance and other services on that corridor, it would obviously make it easier for freight to get in and out of the terminals around other services on the slow lines. In terms of regulation, there's not a huge amount of regulation points basically between London and the southeast coast or Sussex coastline. And one of the key interventions that was identified for the timetable study was a regulation point near Three Bridges Station, so just outside Gatwick Airport, where the 2-track section comes down from 4 if you're going from Brighton. The proposals were to intervene and put another set of points in on the slow lines that would basically allow freight to get out of the way of anything that's coming fast behind it. Obviously, one of the main things was the timetable team found was adjusting and removing passenger services could potentially increase freight services. So adjusting train services is relatively easy to do, but obviously removing passenger services is a different kettle of fish. Double heading of locomotives, there's quite a steep gradient between Hayward Heath and Balcombe Junction. And obviously, in the timetable study, I think they found if the train's loaded, it can take up to at least about 3 or 4 fast passenger paths on that 2-track section. obviously where the constraints around the Croydon, which we've mentioned, but also the West London line obviously is a very busy corridor where a lot of freight is presented onto the Sussex and Kent route from that direction. And obviously that corridor is 2-track with limited places to regulate train services. Got some interesting, challenging gradients around the Mitre Bridge area near Acton, but also it's got a very dense passenger service that's obviously shared between Southern and London Overground. And then finally, one of our other studies we did a few years ago, which was in relation to South London, one of the recommendations was for digital signalling and sort of ETCS between sort of Balham and Clapham Junction, potential benefits that could bring to both passenger and freight on this corridor. So kind of following the same sort of process when we did Brighton Main Line, we also looked at the North Kent line as well, which I'll comment more in a minute in terms of terminals. But obviously the thematic issues that are short and medium term are never going to go away, along with those that in the longer term around sort of terminal capacity, getting freight passed through London. Obviously, South East have recently changed their timetable in the Lewisham area to deconflict all the previous conflicting moves that happened at the crossover at the north end of the station. But obviously, we're fully aware that the demanding growth for that corridor and obviously future freight forecasts obviously plays an important part in actually getting trains through the sort of Lewisham area as one of the key constraints, but also the Dartford area as well, which obviously has a multitude of different services that come via the free routes from the London area. So you've got the Sidcup, the Bexley Heath line, and obviously the North Kent line that runs obviously through Woolwich. So in terms of North Kent, generally, for those of you who don't know, there are a considerable number of freight terminals in that part of North Kent. Angerstein's Wharf is probably one of the busiest freight terminals for freight in North Kent that can only be accessed from one direction. So if you're coming from the Hither Green direction, you go via the curve at Dartford, and then you head back towards London. So you're going anti-clockwise, and obviously adds considerable time for driver hours, fuel, and also has to interface with other sort of slow services, whether that's Thameslink or longer distance sort of metro services to South East, and obviously majority of them either terminate at Dartford or Gravesend. You've got Plumstead as well, which obviously the former Crossrail site that's going to be turned into an aggregates terminal. So DCR Rail are going to be running trains into there in the near future once the terminal has been reconfigured from its current formation. And then obviously you've got the Isle of Grain, which I know Rory's going to talk about a bit later on. But obviously the Isle of Grain creates a significant proportion of traffic on the South East route, and particularly through the North Kent area, given that it's a single track corridor and it has multiple terminals. So Cliff Brett Marine, which I visited fairly recently, is run by Brett's, and they run a significant amount of traffic out of there. And they've been running traffic recently for High Speed 2. You've got the old intermodal terminal at Thamesport that's been used for steel previously, but is currently being used for short-term flows in relation to delivery of finished tunnel portal segments for High Speed 2 for the areas around the West Ruislip area where they have actually started building the tunnels for using their TVM machines. And then you've obviously got Northfleet, obviously not been used for a considerable amount of years, but obviously is still a terminal within the North Kent area that isn't active at the moment. But who knows what happens in the future around that area. And also you've got Who as well. Who Junction is obviously Network Rail used, and obviously is used for our route services that run across the country and serving sort of engineering works as and when they're required. So with the North Kent area, there's lots of different pieces of the jigsaw that don't necessarily fit together. It's a very complex jigsaw at the moment because there are many various other factors that affect freight in that area in relation to the kind of key bullet points that are on your left-hand side of the bottom of the page. So the intention by Medway Council to reintroduce passenger services on this freight-only line and build a new station at Charnel Street, which is between Grain and Hugh Junction itself, but that project's been paused at the moment in relation to funding. The development of the Ebbsfleet area around the London Resort, which one of my colleagues, Paul Best, has been working on. So the proposals to build a brand new theme park outside within the North Kent area has obviously been put on hold, but there are proposals still that potentially one day that might be delivered, even if not in its current sort of proposals that have been put forward at the moment, but potentially in a maybe smaller form. But even so, it's still going to have an impact on freight when majority of people will travel during the day and not necessarily at peak times. Obviously, the success of Crossrail that obviously opened last year, and the number of passengers that have been using that line currently terminates in Abbey Wood for those of you who've used it already, but there are obviously proposals locally to extend Crossrail beyond Abbey Wood. Where to, obviously that's still unknown, but proposals potentially up to Ebbsfleet or the Dartford area, whether those trains would use the existing North Kent line, or they would use a new alignment. That's obviously still something to be acknowledged in future sort of discussions around that. Angerstein's Wharf, the proposals to build a brand new southwest sort of chord into the terminal, which would alleviate the current circular route or anti-clockwise route that freight takes via Dartford, and proposals that might bring to allow longer trains to run in there as well. And the original proposals around the Isle of Grain were also included Hugh Junction for a chord that would obviously allow freight and passenger services to run off the Medway Valley line and through Strood straight onto the Isle of Grain terminals, obviously the AI site as well, which I forgot to mention before. So obviously the London area work, which the Freight Network Strategy team did, obviously is an important key component in terms of unlocking potential for the interventions that were found through that study in delivering sort of future growth around the North Kent area and Brighton Main Line. So I'm going to move on to network capability now, which is obviously quite a the network capability is obviously how the network runs at the moment, how the network runs in the future. But obviously these four key components obviously play a significant role in how we deliver and how we allow freight to run on our network at the moment. So we talk about gauging briefly. Obviously, gauging, there are certain restrictions in place across Kent and Sussex. One area that we are looking at the moment is in relation to gauge clearance between Dollonsmoor and the Channel Tunnel via Maidstone East. So the current gauging on that corridor is W9A on the Kent Classic corridor. Sorry, W9, sorry. But there are proposals to make that W9A, which would then allow the standard boxes that are used across the continent to come directly through the tunnel and go directly to Wembley via Maidstone East on the Classic route, rather than use High Speed 1, which obviously charges a lot of money for anyone to use that part of the network. Heavy axle weight, so allowing the network to maintain its current capability, but also maintain the current dispensations that are in place around running RA10 traffic on our network. There are issues around that in relation to funding for potentially what the interventions might be required and allow the railway to continue running and maintaining the customer requirements for the traffic that currently runs at the moment. The 2/3 rule, which is in relation to signal spacing and quite antiquated, dating back to sort of the 1960s, 1970s, when wagons were a lot different to what runs now, and potential implications of removing the rule around the 2/3 rule in terms of line speeds and line speed boards, and what ETCS and what digital railway might potentially offer and benefit in terms of increasing capacity across the whole southern region, not just Kent and Sussex. We've just started a study called Target 26, which our colleagues in Eastern and London and the London Freight Network Strategy team have just delivered around running longer and heavier aggregate services. But we understand that in terms of the interdependencies around running heavier and longer aggregate services, there are issues in terms of the way the network runs at the moment, especially across Kent and Sussex and also Wessex. But also if there's issues around terminal capacity as well, then obviously means then you can't necessarily always run longer trains up to sort of 26 wagons. So I'm going to go on to decarbonisation now, which obviously is the in thing at the moment in terms of very fashionable thing that everyone is talking about, and quite rightly so. For us, for Kent and Sussex and Wessex, obviously we have a third rail network, but we don't have many locomotives that are capable of using the power at the moment, because the power is not necessarily there and would require further upgrades. So the Class 92s obviously have been around for nearly 30 years now, designed and built to run for traffic through the Channel Tunnel through to France. Haven't necessarily been utilised as well as they may have been, but they are still used, even if they are quite old. But a lot of DB and GBRF have spent a significant amount of money on the locomotives and DBR at the moment in terms of allowing them to run electric locomotives, given they've just DB have stood down their Class 90 fleet for the time being. So in terms of sort of issues, it's kind of identifying what the issues are now in terms of what is the best fit. We don't know what the best fit is for Southern for traction, because diesel's obviously the majority of freight on the Southern region is diesel hauled because it comes from outside the region. So obviously you've got traffic that runs intermodal and further afield from the West Midlands and Manchester area down all the way down to Southampton, serving the terminals down there, the Southampton port area. What are the solutions? Well, I think the solutions need to be holistic in terms of what you actually deliver going forward. But obviously, given the world we're in at the moment, that's very difficult to know what the right answer is, because what one size might fit all for a particular part of the network, but you've got to consider outside the box in terms of the interface that obviously the Kent and Sussex route, Kent, Sussex and Wessex route have with London, and also further afield. And then what are the alternatives? The industry is obviously leading heavily on the alternative options at the moment around HVO fuel. So obviously DB Cargo and Freightliner have been using that. Obviously the terms of cost of that and resourcing, getting that to actually work properly without actually having any detrimental impact on performance of the network is obviously quite paramount. So it's kind of key to understand what those issues are in terms of freight going forward. We have diesel islands, we have some third rail freight that does run, but obviously majority of what we run at the moment is diesel hauled. So what is the best route going forward for decarbonisation on the southern region? It might be batteries that also have diesel capability to do first and last mile, but again at the moment that picture is not very clear as to what the actual answer is. So in terms of new markets, the key markets that we kind of identified through the study was around sort of aggregates traffic. Chesterton itself opened recently, and obviously Plumstead is opening in the future. These terminals obviously have been dormant for a considerable amount of time, or Plumstead still is at the moment. But obviously Chesterton is a prime example of a terminal that was been dormant for many years and has recently been brought back into use by DCR Rail and Kappa Group. Obviously, it's important from a network rail or industry perspective that we maintain the connections onto dormant terminals to therefore allow these terminals to be relatively easy to reactivate. Simon may say differently to that. In terms of express freight, obviously Varamis have been currently running a service between Birmingham International and Scotland using a Class 321, which was formerly a passenger unit, and what potential opportunities there are for the southern region. Obviously, southern region historically used to have a lot of Royal Mail traffic, but obviously when Royal Mail sort of concentrated their efforts mainly in the sort of early 2000s around the sort of west and east coast corridors of the country, rather than the kind of hub and spoke nature of where they ran further afield down to Penzance and obviously down to Tonbridge, where there's still a Royal Mail terminal, but no Royal Mail traffic. And obviously running into city centres as well, so running express freight into London terminals such as Waterloo or Victoria. That has a lot of potential, but obviously logistics around actually allowing those sort of services to run into terminals around when people obviously are using the rail network as well is obviously quite difficult. In terms of intermodal, obviously Wessex have a plethora of intermodal terminals because they've got gauge cleared routes to allow that traffic to run, but obviously for Kent and Sussex specifically, we don't really have intermodal terminals. There were proposals a few years ago to build a terminal at Howbury Park, which is near Slade Green, for those of you who know North Kent, and have a regional distribution or strategic rail freight interchange there. But the proposals of that were blocked by the planning regulator because Thames Gateway had just recently opened, which was specifically sea dredged to a significant level, deep level, to then allow the larger sort of ships to come all the way from sort of Asia and the continent to then serve the sort of East Anglia network and the rest of the country. But we can't give up on that sort of proposal for intermodal. I think there's a lot of potential, but regional distribution centres is one part of that cog, along with having sufficient gauge clearance as well and the paths available on the network to then serve potential terminals around sort of Howbury Park that was proposed, and then Riddham and Fratton and Newhaven and Marchwood, which have rail heads but don't necessarily have any rail traffic at the moment. But they're still within sort of Network Rail's portfolio in terms of rail freight property and the potential they might have in terms of supplementing existing terminals in the area. So Marchwood, for example, on Wessex would obviously potentially provide a supplementary terminal and feeder service to serve sort of the Southampton terminals run by in and around the Maritime and the Western Docks area. So I'm just going to finish just going to give you an overview quickly of what we found out and what we're doing going forward. So I think I've covered most of these things, but there are various challenges going ahead. We understand that. The industry understands that. If you talk to any colleagues in other regions, route freight managers, they'll all say the same thing. There are thematic issues, there are issues, but obviously these issues that I've gone through today, some of them are unique and specific to the southern region. The document that we created and this document summary that I'm showing you now, presenting, obviously was an opportunity for us as Network Rail to actually collate all the information from our stakeholders and gave us an opportunity to actually write down a lot of these things, because you talk to a lot of people in the industry and a lot of those things are in people's heads, which is great, but not necessarily written down on paper. But this is our strategy going forward for the next 30 years. And I'd like to thank Maggie for allowing me to present our findings today. So thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Simon. That's really, really interesting, and a huge amount a huge amount to think about in that, actually, in terms of both sort of the nearer term possibilities, but also the longer term prospects for the region, not only in construction, but in other sectors too. Okay, let us move on to our next speaker, Simon Kendler, who is the Regional Freight Manager for Network Rail, covering Kent, Sussex, and I believe Wessex as well. And Simon's going to give us an update on their work to actually keep the traffic moving on the ground right now. So Simon, thank you very much.
Yes, hello, thank you, Maggie, and I'll try not to go over any of the other aspects that that Simon has covered already. So yes, I am Simon Kendler, I'm the Regional Freight Manager for Network Rail's Southern Freight team. We cover Kent, Sussex, Wessex, and High Speed 1. Hopefully, you can see my screen. I do believe you can. Simon, you can nod. Yes, good.
It's a slideshow.
Yeah, there you go. Now that's it. Right. So a bit about us before we kick off. So who is the freight team? So we are part of System Operator in FNPO, which stands for Freight National Passenger Operators. So that's the all cross countries and Caledonian sleepers who don't fit inside Network Rail's devolved routes and regions setup. So we have 5 teams across the country covering each region, and we are embedded with, but do not work for, Network Rail's regions. So we do work with them in terms of freight performance, a bit about freight strategy, certainly operationally we work with them, but otherwise we are a national freight team, which recognises the fact that, of course, that freight does not respect Network Rail's or any other arbitrary route or regional boundaries. Freight has got to go from point A to point B, and quite often, particularly on Southern, we'll find that we are either an origin or a destination, not generally or always both. So a little bit about our objectives. So you can see that they focus around things like sustainable growth, around safety, customer and communities, about our people, about being efficient, and about service delivery. So obviously we're gearing up at the minute for Control Period 7 or CP7, which starts at the beginning of April of next year in 2024, and gearing up for our response and our plans for the next 5 years from that point. Focusing on Southern, this is a bit of a catch-all for many of our flows across the region, as well as on Kent and Sussex. So as Simon's already touched upon, we have intermodal traffic, which mainly focuses around the ports around Southampton and the docks in that area, and those freight flows go generally via Reading and the Western to all parts of the all points north, Midlands, northwest and northeast of England. We also have the Channel Tunnel, which has various flows, such as the Ford trains, which traverse HS1 to get to Ripple Lane. We have steel trains, we've got the water trains, we've got Toyota cars, which is a really special working, as that both imports and exports cars, both from the UK into the UK and out of the UK into mainland Europe, and also special movements such as new rolling stock deliveries, so new trains being delivered for Merseyrail, Transport for Wales, and for Tyne and Wear are also being delivered via the Channel Tunnel at this time. So I've mentioned automotive, so we do have the Toyota flow now running through the Channel Tunnel. That is a train a day, so generally 6 trains a week run one in each direction, which goes to a facility at Toton next to DB, where they offload and ramp on the cars. And we also have on Wessex Route, we have from the Midlands and from the Western region, we have car flows down to the south and eastern docks also for export, with some busy flows there. In the construction sector, we have the quarried stone and sea-dredged aggregate, which can originate from various areas. Quarried stone tends to come from the Mendips and rails in there, and then we have various sea-dredged aggregate facilities across Kent, which Simon's also alluded to, with many of these flows going to various plants, particularly to such customers such as Tarmac, you'll hear from shortly after me, with lots of services to particularly London terminals, which present their own challenges. We have some terminals which are in some very centrally located areas, right in the midst of and intertwined with very busy commuter railways, and other campaign traffic we have, such as the Telon segments, which is the daily flow running from the Isle of Grain to West Ruislip, and later on this year the spoil flows are due to be starting up again, which is taking spoil out of HS2, which is loaded onto the trains at Willesden. If you're travelling north of the West Coast Main Line, you'll see it on your left hand side as you pass Wembley Yard, and that is taken to various locations, one of which will be Cliff Brett Marines later this year. That will restart. Also sticking with grain, we've got the aviation fuel traffic. That's 2 trains a day currently. So the Isle of Grain provides 60% of Heathrow Airport's fuel. Some of that is piped, some of that is roaded in, and a good chunk of that is delivered by the 2 freight trains a day, which run, and those are heavy freight trains, which GBRF use their specially low-geared locos for, of which there are only 4 currently in the country. And other moves we have, such as the nuclear decommissioning, which takes place at either Winfrith, Magnox, which is way down near Weymouth, and Dungeness, which those of you who've been on the Romney Hythe and Dymchurch Railway will know, very familiar down there on the Kent coast. So some stats, these give you a bit of an idea of the number of trains that run on the southern region in a year. You'll tend to find the bulk of those will be on Kent and Wessex routes, so probably about half that number roughly will be running on Kent and Sussex in any given year. Yet to get the details yet for the last financial year. So that gives you a bit of an idea there. This is our commodity flows map. So this shows you by different flows where traffic tends to run and where it doesn't run. From this we can work out things like what our critical assets are, what are our key junctions, where are we work with the routes and regions to ask them where have you got focus for key spares if we have a points failure or if we have a cracked crossing or something like that. Where can you go in and where's the best place to have strategic spares? Well, it's going to be the locations where if we lose a junction we do not have a diversionary route, so we work with the routes to highlight the key important routes. If you look at Lewisham, which is kind of top right, lots of lines going through there, you'll see that Lewisham is an absolutely key area for us and is a great focus for us on particularly for Kent and Sussex, and the South London line corridor through Denmark Hill heading towards the West London line, a key route for most freight traffic coming off Kent and Sussex, and also obviously one of the regulatory Channel Tunnel routes as well. Now, this is a bit of a map on, give you a bit of an idea, a snapshot of what type of facilities we have across Southern region, either those which are rail connected facilities, some of that includes heritage railways like the Bluebell Railway, it includes sites which are yet to get active or are completely active or active sites as well, and some of those includes our engineers yards where you'll see some of our yellow trains hiding around, getting very busy now as we're doing autumn delivery. In terms of Kent and Sussex strategy and the growth challenges and opportunities, I think the key aspects highlighted here. First and foremost, we're about freight safety and the safety of the operational railway, both for our customers, for our staff, and obviously for passengers who are travelling on passenger services. So there's a lot of work we do in the safety space all day, every day. We obviously live and breathe safety. Some of our other key aspects in terms of growth and how we achieve that. We're very cognizant that even though we are in the new normal, we are still trying to feed lots of freight traffic through what is essentially a commuter railway, excuse me, and also a railway which has been very steered towards commuter railway for decades and decades, and we're still in a post-COVID adjustment period. This means we have to challenge things like the notional quote-unquote peak ban to freight traffic. There's nothing written down say we can't run a freight train somewhere at 8 o'clock in the morning, but we have to have very challenging conversations because of the potential impacts if something were to go wrong on people or on people travelling into and out of central London. As alluded to before, we have 2 key routes getting freight trains north to south from Kent and Sussex, particularly, and that's the West London line, which has got a very tricky gradient for northbound trains, and also the route via Kew over Barnes Bridge, which has some unique structural challenges which we found out late last year, which we've been working with the route on to solve. Another kind of key aspect of Southern region in terms of our capability, in terms of traction and wagons, assets, etc., is around challenging gradients. We have lots of tricky gradients, which are generally all in the wrong places. They tend to be just off the end of a junction where we might be regulating a freight service to keep them, paths around or regulated around other busy passenger services or even other freight trains. But sometimes that might be at the bottom of a hill, which for autumn period, you can imagine, can cause us some challenges when we're running busy corridors of freight and passenger trains. We have electrification, but we also don't have electrification, which is something Simon alluded to before. We have the DC third rail, it's there, we try not to step on it, but from a freight point of view, we are a diesel railway. The only freight traffic in this part of the world which operates regularly as electrically hauled is the Ford trains which run by HS1. So I suppose we could say that they are cheating. One of the things that we are trying to look at going forward is about running longer and heavier. It means our customers, such as our Tarmacs, our Days, our Bretts, are able to put more on a train, which means that we can, better use our pathing. We can better thread that through, the southern region railways. But that also puts on pressures because we've been running heavier trains, RA9, RA10 traffic over structures where we have a particular challenge, both in Anglia, Kent and Sussex. We have particular challenges around structural capability. We've got a lot of historic assets. Many of them are brick masonry or metallic underbridges, which we have an old estate. We're 2 years off the 2025 200 years of rail in Britain, which we'll be celebrating in a couple of years. But we must remember that day to day that causes some challenges for us. Another big part of our work, which again Simon excuse me, has alluded to, is the delivery of new freight sites for new freight flows, something we're very keen to help and support with, and also uprating and trialing heavier flows as well. So we've run service plan reviews, or SPRs, to experiment with trying to run trains even with standard class 66s up gradients, which on tonnages which we haven't previously tried, to see if it works all year round. Obviously, we've got to make sure that the train is able to run sufficiently with good performance on a greasy rail up a hill, both in autumn and not in autumn. And obviously, a big part of our work is working with and encouraging new customers to market. Rail can be a bit of a complicated place to try and get involved in, and obviously supporting new markets, whether that's express logistics or other, is a big part of what we do. So I've kind of run through this mainly already. A couple of other things I'll kind of highlight, which again I think I'm not going to repeat myself for what Simon's already has outlined, but I think maximising our freight property estate is a big part of the work that we do, and some of that can be making sure that we keep hold of infrastructure or mothballed infrastructure so we can reactivate sites easily. That is a big challenge because we're being pressured all the time to release assets, release infrastructure, and try and make an efficiency saving. But obviously that can be very challenging to do, and we're in a very challenging financial environment, both for public and private sector funding. So how can we encourage those and work together to try and encourage investment and make best value for money there as well, and that I think is a key part of what we do as well. So we celebrated the opening of New Haven Marine not too long ago, which was a new facility for aggregates. We've got the aviation fuel, the Channel Tunnel flows, and we're celebrating new flows from grain, particularly DC rail, running out of locations like grain to new facilities, and we're supporting them with the opening of Plumstead, which will hopefully be coming online soon. Salford's another facility we're trying to get open as soon as possible, and possibilities around Sheerness in Kent, an area which hasn't seen much freight action for quite a while. So very keen to reactivate freight traffic in that area. Another key aspect of what we do is around freight performance. Freight performance, as you can see from these tables here, around our FDM metrics, which is around our kind of daily performance and how we are assessed and regulated by the Office of Rail and Road, the rail regulator. And cancellations, obviously something we try and drill into our route colleagues, which is that if a train doesn't get to a customer, that could be the equivalent of losing Waterloo for the whole of the day. So these are the messages that we try to get across about the importance of even one train could be absolutely critical to our customers and getting that freight focus with our route and regional colleagues. You can see that over the last couple of years, we've had a challenge. Performance on the left has dropped, but is now climbing back up again as we try and get a bit of stability, particularly after the disruption of last year's industrial action on Network Rail, and also cancellations, which went certainly the wrong direction, are starting to see the moving only average is starting to go in the correct direction, which is down for cancellations. And again, we talked about safety, what we're doing in that space very quickly. We're trying to work with our regional colleagues to ensure we have derailment reduction, fettling up our methods of work, making sure we keep on top of our joint safety tours, highlighting any safety concerns, vegetation management, which if anyone's travelled by train recently, we've had a very difficult summer for vegetation growth, of perfect conditions for rain and then sunny weather, which has meant we've had a record growth, and also our FSIP program, our Freight Safety Improvement Portfolio, where we've spent millions of pounds putting in walking routes at various locations you can see listed there, and we're getting a bit more money for CP7 as well. Not as much as CP6, but still some significant funding for more improvements there as well. These are some of the areas across the region where we've put in various improvements. These could be around walking routes, it can be around new rake or switch stands, which are much more ergonomic to use than the old-fashioned hand point levers, improving connections, and also things like fencing and lighting to help with our customers on the ground in operating trains. This is Angustine's Wharf, just around the corner from Tarmac, where you can see the shiny new GRP waffle boarding, which we're very proud. If you go on Google Earth, you can see them from space. And more importantly, they are delivering excellent improvements in safety, and we are, as I say, got delivery ongoing. You'll be seeing these popping up all over the region in various locations to improve workers' safety. And a final note on charters, mentioned before, we've got a couple of bases on our region, which is Belmont, operated by DB Cargo at Stuarts Lane, and the Hastings diesel unit at St Leonard's down in Hastings. We have a lot of London-based charter traffic running around. They fall under our freight colleagues to manage, and we deal with things like this, again, vegetation and other various operational elements to help our charter customers deal with their special aspect of their market. So that's a little bit of a summary of what we're doing on Kent and Sussex, and I hope you found that interesting and informative, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was brilliant, and a huge amount of work going on across the region there with you and the team. Okay, let us move to our final presentation. Rory Higgens from Tarmac, who's going to give us an end user point of view on all matters in Kent and Sussex, and indeed perhaps nationally. Rory, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll try and keep it brief to give a bit of time, so we've got some Q&A time at the end. So yeah, I'll try and be prompt if I can get the IT to work. Is that working? Is that working? Sorry.
Yeah, it's working.
Perfect. Thank you. So for those that don't know, Tarmac is part of the CRH group. So CRH operate nationally across 29 countries. Last year was $53 billion worth of sales. So they're number one supplier of building materials in America and in Europe. And for those that probably already know, they were recently listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Well, that formally went live last week. So in terms of Tarmac ourselves, so we operate across all regions in the UK. The average sort of train size is 1450. These figures are a little out of date, but it's circa 9 million tonnes a year. And then some sort of stats, we operate up to 30 daily trains. An aggregate train sort of takes 66 loaded lorries off the road, and a cement train takes 54. So, you know, in terms of that environmental piece, it's big numbers. So as a company, we very much stand on our own, but we are trying to align with the CRH group. So we've got a number of targets across the whole of our European division. One of those is to develop and implement a new planning system, and the system's called Eversense, which we are going through now and hope to have sort of established and live and used over the next sort of 12 to 18 months, which will be good for us and a huge step forward, whereas at the minute it's pretty much all manual and using Excel-based ordering systems. So that's good, and something we're working with our freight colleagues on and implementing. Our wider strategy, I suppose, is talking about stuff that's already been discussed. So, you know, faster trains, longer trains. You know, and I suppose we, as a team, we're always thinking, how do we do stuff differently? sort of opening new terminals which sort of offer a one-stop shop for aggregate and construction. So I'll quickly move on because I'm just very much conscious of time. So one of the big focuses within Tarmac at the minute is all around the net zero strategy. So this is sort of a timeline of where we're at to get to net zero over the next sort of 27 years now. And our target's there, 2033. So we've got a lot to do. This is sort of how we get there. And I suppose what I really want to draw out from an industry point of view here is actually the road piece. The road logistics supplies is moving at a pretty good pace, whereas actually the rail element, and probably one for discussion at the end, is it's probably fair to say has not got the same strategy at the minute with all the disruption across the industry. So if we're not careful, both the environmental argument and the economies of scale argument we use today won't stack up in 7 years' time, 8 years' time. So it's very much one I want probably everyone to think about. That's the end of the slide. So in terms of specifically Kent and Sussex, so in terms of the area itself, in terms of where we operate, it's probably one of our quieter areas due to, so I suppose, our routes to market. But it's still important. It's right for us. So I suppose some of the bits that resonate with me and probably apply nationally. Rail to Tarmac is a key part of our logistics. It's core to what we do, so it's important. It's on everybody's mind, and we have clear strategies of how we focus that. The current constraints on the Kent and Sussex area in terms of passenger versus freight is one that we need to seriously think about, because it does prohibit growth. Tarmac, we're a profit-making organisation, so anything we do has got to be built on a sound business case. Now, if we don't have security around supply of paths, for example, how do you build that business case? How do you then develop and grow freight? Other bits, so my previous experience, I've been with Tarmac now 3 months, but prior to that I worked for GB Rail Freight as their HS2 account manager, delivering the Stone out of the Peak districts and the tunnel segment trains out of the Isle of Grain, for example, across the West Rise Loop. So, a challenge, for example, around the whole capacity piece is if the train was late for whatever reason onto the Isle of Grain branch, that service then could end up being regulated for a couple of hours. Due to that then delay, you would then hit the northwestern central region too late and hit a load of Section 5 possessions, and therefore the train ended up getting cancelled, which obviously we ended up letting the customer down. But that's sort of one challenge of the resilience piece, I suppose. The other bits that sort of spring to my mind, and it's Simon, you've talked about it, and well, both Simons have talked about it. It is that control priorities piece. Not viewing one freight train as the same passenger train. For example, our London area, there's probably a misconception across the aggregate sector. It's all right, it's just a load of stone. They can not run that one train and come in and deliver another shed load of stone. Actually, our London sites, for example, are all built on postage stamps. We run trains pretty much just in time. So if we don't have that train delivered that week, that generally means we have to road it in, which I suppose from an environmental point of view is not very good, and from a business point of view it's not as cost effective, so it ends up hurting your back pocket. So that's a challenge. Again, Simon Kendler alluded to this. Condition of assets does worry me. We've had a pretty good performance across the region by Network Rail this year, but it's probably fair to say that the overall climate has been kind. We've not had the high constant temperatures of 40 degrees. It's kind of been a bit wet, but we've not had huge amounts of flash flooding, for example. So I'd like to see Simon Hulse, these plans and strategies draw out that around weather resilience, asset condition, all of which are, I suppose, hugely important to our business, and I suppose internally people trusting that rail delivers, because it's important from our side that when we get asked by the business or our suppliers for a train, that train turns up. So I'm going to shut up now because I'm conscious we've got 5 minutes left and we very much really want to ask some questions. So I'm happy to answer any questions, or if you want to ask more about Tarmac. So apologies, that was a bit rushed. But...
Thank you very much, Rory. Thank you. That's brilliant. And I think, you make a really good point there about the just-in-time nature of the aggregates business, which is consistently overlooked. It's absolutely critical to the development of any new infrastructure, houses, flats, schools, and all the things that people hold dear, that those trains run on time. And that's the message that is, I know Simon work incredibly hard to try and drive home in a region which is dominated by passengers. Right, thank you. We've got a couple of questions that have been posed. Craig has asked about the potential for intermodal terminals. I mean, Craig's business sell train control systems at point and stuff for terminals. But Simon K, you talked a little bit about, or Simon H, about Highbury Park. But do we think that there's still potential for rail and warehousing south of the river?
Simon, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can do. Yeah, I think the problem with obviously southeast, there isn't any regional distribution centres like the Golden Triangle around Rugby, Northampton, Daventry area, and obviously wider East Midlands area. Obviously, is the prime example of what maybe we'd like to have. But obviously, planning policy going forward during the baselining of the work I did. When I did a research on rail through local policies, there was hardly anything. It was either passenger based or there was nothing there at all. So I think, like, in terms of regional distribution centres, there has to be a drive towards it in terms of modal shift. But obviously, if the gauge clearance isn't there, and you can't get the paths to sort of these locations, and obviously it's very difficult, as we know already through the work that obviously why Highbury Park obviously got canned at the start. So I think it's something that should be pushed, but obviously requires industry buy-in and obviously third-party investment. And the way the planning policy works in this country needs to change to include rail within the planning policies, that to provide modal shift and to get modal shifts, that rail has to be paramount to delivery of getting materials to where they need to be.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I mean, I was very struck on a family trip to Sheerness, don't ask, but we did, about the growth of warehousing in North Kent, I think, as a consequence of Brexit. And I suspect over time we might see, some hubbing potential at Thamesport and Sheerness and places like that, as if that trend to warehousing in North Kent continues to grow. I'm going to read out this question and answer, which Simon K has kindly answered. Ralph had asked, following the research work he was doing for RSSB, review of SRTs and operational arrangements could increase train length on the West London line. And Simon said, looking to assess traction haulage capability to tackle the gradients and work on the load book to assess traction capabilities. More work needs to be done. Simon, is there anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think we rely on the loads book, and it's a bit like Simon mentioned before about the 2/3 rule. We rely on some systems which are a bit anachronistic in the 21st century. We need these being updated, which can be backed up by a better and proper captured data on traction capabilities. But we have to then balance that push for wanting to run longer and heavier trains against also not wanting to have for example, a slit to a stand incident on the West London line, which means that we will have a London Overground services being delayed, which we get a lot of feedback from on the rare occasion that does happen from London Overground TfL. So I think it's about striking the balance. But yeah, open and keen for more work in that space.
Cool, thank you. Okay, and I'm going to throw a final question in before we come to a close. Simon, you and I sport Simon K routinely about announcements from our passenger colleagues about failed freight trains, which turn out to be tampers, or more often than not, a freight train which has been poorly regulated somewhere else on the network. How are we going to get through that?
Well, I think there's lots of colleagues that are keen, I think, at the right levels to work together as a railway and not throw the blame around. But I think the railway is a large organisation, and getting that message through consistently is probably one of our biggest challenges. I think we need to start that at home sometimes. We've had interesting conversations in my team when we've had to be called in to look at what are considered network rail freight trains, which strictly speaking my team don't look after, but to some people a train is a train is a train. But yeah, I think we need to be a bit more consistent about that, and I think, as I said before, I think we just need to be absolutely clear on the value of freight customers, that they have every right to be on the railway. We need more freight on rail if we're going to improve our society, both economically and environmentally, and therefore we need to make sure that they are treated equally alongside passenger operators.
Absolutely, and we'll keep fighting the good cause on that. Okay, we are right on the hour. It's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Simon, and Rory, for your input today. It's really good to spend some time looking at these regions, which are so often overlooked in the narrative about rail freight, but so critically important for aggregates, but for all those other commodities as well, Channel Tunnel, of course, and many, many more beside. Just for those of you who are on our Rail Freight Group Intermodal Forum, we did have a presentation from Jonathan Williams at that regarding gauge clearance through Kent for Channel Tunnel traffic. If you're not on our Intermodal Forum and you want the slides from that, do give me a shout as well, and we can get those over to you. That's not recorded because it's a member forum, but we can certainly share the slides. And if you want the slides from today, drop Phil or myself an email and we'll get those slides circulated out to you soonest. This will go on YouTube probably later today or perhaps tomorrow, just depending on the team availability, but soon. If you want to know any more about freight in Network Rail in Kent and Sussex, Simon, I'm sure will be only too happy to hear from you, and Rory obviously has already made the offer relating to Tarmac. So that's all from us. Thank you ever so much for joining. Enjoy the rest of your afternoons, everyone. Thank you very much.